Well, hello and welcome to the Tim Mosso podcast. Thank you for joining us. And by us, I do mean distinguished company. We have on the show today Mr. David Walter, clockmaker, watchmaker, a veteran of horology, a contemporary and a peer of the likes of George Daniels, Derek Pratt, Anthony Randall. David, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you.
Good to have you on. And I think to look back on your history, I think a lot of folks who are listening to this podcast might already know the story of how you got started in Perth in the remote regions of Australia, later headed over to Europe to pursue your trade. But I think what they don't understand is the clockmaking. And I think they need to understand why it is clocks and not watches that were your original claim to fame and prominence.
Oh, I mean, I worked for Omega for a long time. And in the late 70s, the watch trade was in severe crisis with the quartz revolution and cheap, accurate quartz watches from Japan particularly, but Hong Kong and Taiwan too. And the industry was convulsing. It wasn't sure what to do. Electronics was supposed to be the way forward. Mechanical was supposed to be dated. And initially, 70s, I actually was up to working on what the latest electronics were, but I found them very unsatisfying, ungratifying. And then eventually I decided that I didn't want to do electronics at all and was happy with mechanicals. At the same time, I could see that watch trade was not looking really strong, but at that time, clocks or clock servicing, particularly in the antique world, was doing very well. And so I decided to go into clocks because that had a future in it. Plus, I wanted to make things. And I started off, my plan was to make a watch. And I had a pocket watch I was going to copy, an English pocket watch. But I simply couldn't get tooling or enough tooling. I had some, but not enough. And in those days of pre-email and pre-fax, sourcing tooling out of Switzerland was extremely difficult. And it was kind of a closed shop. So while I was looking for tooling, I came across what I was looking for that would do for clocks. And I thought, well, okay, I have to make something. So I don't want to do nothing. So I started on making clocks. And from then, the first couple were emulations of antique pieces that came through that I had. And then later on, I designed my own pieces of variations from what was there, which were not copies. They were the Brigade double pendulum type clock is a good example. Not only was it based on that clock, but I added complications and improvements to it. Because I want, instead of just making a copy, I was never for copying something. I think if you're going to do something, try and be original. Not easy, but try.
You actually helped me fall in love with clocks because, I've been out to the American Watchmakers Clockmakers Institute in Harrison, Ohio. And, I went on the watch side of things to learn, to observe, to kind of learn the history too. And I visited the clock workshops and I kind of didn't get it at the time. I was impressed, but I didn't get it. When I heard you talking about the accuracy of clocks during your lecture to the New York Horological Society, I was floored. Now, remember, a chronometer, folks in the audience, can be -4 + 6 seconds in a day. What is the order of accuracy you're looking at with your best clocks? Help our audience fall in love with this.
It will vary on the clock and it will vary on the conditions in which it's at. I'm in California, so we have earthquakes. Doesn't like things. Houses are stud frames. That's not a stable support for a high precision clock. I think, I've had several clocks running at better than a second a month. I'm content with a second a month, but ideally, it could actually be much better than that. And I think I remember that thing. I don't remember the exact number, but I think I did have one of my double pendulum clocks running, not in a vacuum, just in open air, which is not an ideal situation. And that clock, for some days, I had that running at an accuracy of 0.01 seconds per year. Now, in terms of just plain physical capacity, it can't keep that up simply because now the moon starts to affect the clock. The moon makes high tide, low tide. When it comes into low tide, the sea level rises, which also rises the water table on dry land, and that affects the flow of gravity, and the gravity affects the pendulum. And so the plot of the moon, the path of the moon can actually be plotted against a graph, but really at that point we now need to be in a vacuum to do better. I mean, as it stands, I'm maybe a mile from the 101 freeway, and there's quite a long bridge over a river. Oh, go away. There's quite a long bridge over a river near us, not in summertime, but in wintertime when the soil is wet. Vibrations travel better through wet soil than they do through dry. And I can actually measure the semis crossing the bridge going kabump, kabump over the concrete joints. So that's fairly accurate.
So we've got our friends out in cyberspace listening to this. Remember, your Breitling Super Quartz with an ETA thermaline quartz, chronometer certified, thermocompensated. That's going to be about 10 to 12 seconds a year. This can be achieved with a clock, folks. A clock made of mechanical components with traditional hand tools. That is very cool. Okay. Now, you've mentioned in the past that you've delivered over 200 clocks, and I know watch collectors pretty well. But who is the customer for a clock? I'm not sure I have a picture of him or her in my head.
They vary. There's few clock collectors who just sort of collect numerous items from the same maker. In truth, there's not very many makers either. In the last 50, 60, maybe even 100 years. Sometimes they want it decorative. A decorative piece as well as an accurate piece. Sometimes people want something, I would like that, but I want something nobody else has. And that's one of the things I actually specialized in doing, was of making something you couldn't go somewhere else and buy. You know, the double pendulum clock I made was based on the Queen's clock by Breguet. Breguet made three, I believe. One was lost in a fire in the late 1800s, and the one is in Buckingham Palace, and the other one is in the museum in Paris. None are for sale, right? So it wouldn't matter what you wanted. I don't think Buckingham Palace needs to sell their clock, and they probably never will.
I think they're right with no, I was just joking.
Is make things that are not generally available, yet, you know, hopefully accurate and attractive. A lot of high precision clocks actually fall into the category of precision instruments, and the point was not to make them look pretty, was to make them efficient. And so often, you might say, domestic beauty is swapped over for technical efficiency. Doesn't, you know, and if you like it, if you appreciate it, they're pretty, but they're kind of, functional objects.
Without a doubt. I do have a question for you about escapements, balances versus, well, I guess regulators, we'll call them, balances versus pendulums. Do you find that when you're working with a watch collector, they're more interested in balance-driven clocks as opposed to pendulum-driven clocks?
No, I think it falls into two categories. Like, watch collectors often do not like pendulums. You know, they're also much more difficult to move. You know, you can pick up a clock or a watch with a balance in, and you just pick it up and move it. But with a pendulum, it's now falling into a whole different category. And it's not so much that they're fragile as just that they're delicate, and you certainly don't want to damage them. So it makes moving them around difficult. As well, of course, if you have a clock with a seconds pendulum, it's a meter long, and you now have this large object that you can't really just pick up and show people. So, and whatever happens, it still boils down. Pendulums are more accurate than balances, and that's it. There is no argument about this.
So now, this is a thought that occurred to me the other day. I can think of a lot of the major watchmakers of our time, people whose names have been on brands. Michel Parmigiani, Kari Voutilainen, Peter Speakmarin, and they all sort of got their start as professionals in restoration. Could you talk a bit about how restoration influenced your path as a watchmaker?
Sure, actually, I mean, restoration is a way many people in the independents have actually learned. You know, they did their initial training somewhere, and they had a taste for something else, and certainly restoration can be frustrating, but it can also be fascinating as well as always informative. Even if it's only, remember, that's a really bad idea and I'm never going to do that, or that's a really good idea and I wish I'd thought of it before. And it also gives a grounding into solving problems. You have to make something that that presumably if it's damaged or lost, you have to make something that fits into the item that you wish, that you want to, and look like it belongs, not sort of, and be sympathetic to it, as well as work. And no parts are available. If something is missing, whatever it is, you are going to have to make it. So it's a good way to learn those skills of how to make things before you actually start making your own pieces. And one of the things that tripped me over in doing it is I actually did a restoration for, I think it was a 1880s Patek chronograph or something that was in rough condition. And this was when I was still in Vienna. And I gave the guy the bill for it when he sort of nearly fell over. And he said, my God, he said, you only repaired it, you didn't make it. And I said, actually, you're wrong. I had to remake numerous levers and springs in this, so I did. And he said, well, you still only repaired it. So, okay. So I said, to hell with it, I'm not doing any more work for you. I'm going away to make my own watch. And he said, good. And when you do, I'll buy it from you. And yes, I did. And no, he didn't.
Didn't follow up.
It kind of gave me the impulse to sort of, you know, to some point, if you can make most of these things, making a complete watch is a pretty big deal. But if the more you have experience on how to make, the little bit easier it becomes. But certainly designing your own piece is not easy because there's all manner of things from in the layout that all have to work with each other and not interfere with each other. And planning that out can be challenging.
That's a fascinating kind of conclusion, because I know I've heard a lot of watchmakers say that they learned more, like F.P. Journe, from working on restorations than from watch school itself.
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, watch school is like a school. It gives you reality. It gives you the basic skills to repair things. Today, as I understand it, the watch schools, except for oh, what's his name, Heinrich something in Le Château de Fonds, who has a school there. The rest of the school, really, what they're doing is they're training technicians to service today's modern watches, which is what industry needs. Perfectly sensible. And so they're not really teaching like how to make and repair and restore. They're just teaching what they need for that, which is good for them. But certainly the teaching at school, even it gave you the basic skills, a broad range of skills, even if not in depth, at least touching the subject somewhat, so that you could then go ahead and tackle other things. And I had friends who were not interested in doing anything challenging or difficult. They were quite happy just doing normal, straightforward service, which is perfectly fine. And certainly, the world needs them then and today too. But there were a handful of us who wanted to do something else, and there were even a smaller handful who actually did it. And of all the students who were trained over the years, I know if we go back, I think Sean did his training in the 80s, 70s or late 70s, 80s. Out of that time, there might have been, let's say 500 watchmakers trained. Really, they're not watchmakers, they're watch service technicians. And it's an old phrase that's held over. But out of those 500, there's how many out there? 20?
Yeah.
Who are actually making something.
Now, I know F.P. Journe said that when he got out of watch school, he realized he had no idea how to make a watch. You went from Perth to London, from London to Vienna, and then sort of you took like a literal and spiritual journey around the world that led you to the conclusion that you wanted to be a maker, not just a service technician. Could you sort of guide me through how that thinking evolved?
I make a long story short, is I actually wanted to contribute something. And I felt when I was reflecting about that, the time I was working for Amiga, I got paid well. I did okay. I was mostly enjoying the work, but towards the latter years, I had become honestly bored with it, and I felt I was just sort of just doing. I was not contributing anything to quality and improvement in things in the world. I was just, doing work, servicing stuff that had been made, uh, but I hadn't contributed anything myself. So this is my contribution to quality. So I try and do something that others haven't done, and try and match as high a standard as I can. And some days are much better than others. And as I work alone, I don't have the advantage of volume, or a bunch of employees, or farming stuff out to have things finished. And so it tends to be done here alone, which I'm quite content with that. But it does have some limitations in that, sometimes in working with, I talk to other people and they make a suggestion, that's a good way to do that, or do it this way, not that way. Again, something maybe I hadn't thought of. So it's gone.
No. Continue. I definitely don't want to cut you off.
So I felt that most people that I knew didn't really contribute much to the world. They were essentially working for their retirement and maybe enjoying their occupation, but there was nothing. I wanted to do more than that. I wanted to leave something. And somewhat that comment I made about the Patek I restored for somebody with missing parts, like you only repaired it, you didn't make it. And I thought, he didn't insult me. Actually, if anything, it was a catalyst to sort of, okay, I got you. Then it's time to do something.
So now, obviously, Roger W. Smith, he drew heavily on inspiration and his relationship with George Daniels, and George Daniels drew heavily on Breguet. A lot of watchmakers have inspirations. F.P. Journe learned largely from his uncle in Paris. Did you have an inspiration, either someone you knew personally or a watchmaking figure in history who inspired you at any point?
I first learned about Daniels when I was in London in 1970. There was an article about him making the watch. And I feel guilty. I should have known about him, but I didn't. But certainly that, not right away, but later on, George inspired me simply by the fact that he did it. And he got told, the same as I got told, oh, you can't do it by yourself. And in truth, no matter what happened in the past, somebody, Breguet, for example, didn't sit down and make the entire watch or clock from start to finish. He had a whole slew of workers, whose job was to make springs, wheels, pinions, escapements, balances, click springs, hands, everything. And they all came together under one roof. So rarely did anyone make the complete watch or clock for that matter. And George was nice proof that it could be done. And everybody, agrees with that. But certainly, in the Breguet has always inspired me, and Ante Janvier, which most people have never even heard of. Part of it, I think, is because Breguet was primarily watches, Janvier was primarily clocks, and he made some exquisite, complicated pieces that just unbelievable. And Jean and Vianney Halter are Janvier aficionados too. Not a lot of people never even heard of him.
It's funny you mention that, because when you go to the F.P. Journe factory, they'll let you beat on any minute repeater or grand sonnery, rip through the astronomic souverain, have fun with any of the watches they bring out for you to see. There's an anti-Janvier clock there, and they said no one but Francois Paul touches that clock. It's one of the resonant clocks.
Yes. Yeah. No, exactly. And understood. Yes. In some ways, watches are more robust because they were meant to be picked up and worn, where clocks, once they're really strong and they work, but they really often don't like being messed with.
Now, it's fascinating because you're not an engineer, you're not a mathematician, you're not an astronomer, and yet you've built clocks that have many astronomic complications that depend on this kind of knowledge. How did you gain it without a formal engineering education?
What I did, I tell this to students. One of the things I do is that if it was done in the past, there's no reason why it can't be done today. is one thing. You think of something that Breguet did, or anybody else from 200 years ago, even 100 years ago. If it was done in the past without even electricity, never mind computers and extensive libraries and calculators, there's no reason it can't be done today. So given that as a starting point, now you can think about how can I find out about this? And all the complications and astronomical things, what I did when I needed to know about something, I went and learned about that subject, not the entire subject of physics or astronomy, just that little narrow window that I was interested in today, and found out what I needed to know with that, and went from there. So it's really possible for anyone to really do it. Might it help if you had more training and things? Yes, but then that takes years all by itself, and it's a separate occupation all alone.
Because, I have spoken to David Kondo, and he's an engineer and he's a watchmaker. He built a tourbillon. And then I see some of the work you've done, and I realized, well, this guy's not an engineer at all, but he's built high celestial complication stuff that Isaac Newton had to invent calculus to figure out back, 400 years ago. So it is very impressive. I guess, technically speaking, is there any frontier that you haven't pressed? I mean, you've built wristwatches, you've built clocks, you've built clocks with 19 complications. I mean, what comes next from a watchmaking standpoint or a clockmaking standpoint?
With clocks, actually, the one thing I would like to do would be, I would actually like to push the limits of what the double pendulum clock could achieve in accuracy. And that would, and I keep sort of toying with this idea, but to make a double pendulum clock similar to what I've done, but with no complications, because every complication adds a drain on the mechanism. It's a load, it's a drain, even if it's intermittent, it's still there. So I was, and build that clock and fit it into a vacuum to see what sort of accuracy I can get at it. Because I admit the first one it was far more accurate than what I had envisaged by a long, long way. And then I realized that these things could be super accurate. And I already proved that. One of the difficulties, at least in the watch world, somewhat the same, Mosso and clocks, is the pendulum is the regulating organ. The escapement simply keeps the thing in motion, and by that motion tells you the time. If you build a better pendulum, the first thing you run into is a thermometer. You need to have temperature compensation. So you can cure that, and now we have better materials today than there was 100 years ago, especially 200 years. After you've got the thermometer fixed, you find you now have a barometer. So you have to have barometric compensation, which is again possible to do, and which I've done. You can add it on. And then once you've actually got that done, you now realize you have a seismograph, and there's no way to fix that. And I've recorded earthquakes on my accurate clocks, and earthquakes I haven't even been able to feel show up quite strongly. And and that's one of the problems with California of, not having, ideally, probably a stable support for a high accurate clock would be, I don't know, a 20-foot piece of, say, 3 foot wide by 2 foot thick steel reinforced concrete buried into the soil with dampening material around it. But somehow they won't let me do it in the living room. And even then, it's one of the reasons why the US timekeepers are in Colorado, because it's the most stable region of the country. And every other country has exactly the same sort of principle. So when it comes to watches, actually I'm working on a new caliber watch at the moment, a wristwatch, of course, which is I'm kind of 2/3 of the way through it. And this time with the sweep seconds, not a sub-seconds. And it will have, I'm not sure. This is an experiment. The dial, nobody's seen this, okay? Am I too close or too far? Can you see it?
Yeah, you could see it well. Arabic numerals.
Arabic numerals. That's been cut out like that. If I get closer, does it stay in focus?
Yeah, it's focusing on your face, I think. Oh, now it's in focus. I see it well. Yes, that
Okay,
is this
okay, so
yours or Josh Shapiro?
yes, we do. We work together on
No,
dials. Yeah, and well, I'm helping him with his movements where I can as well. But he's doing well.
but is
He's
this
showing good
dial
progress.
yours?
This dial's mine.
Oh, yes.
Sorry. Josh lasered it out for me, but the graphics are mine. And so what this will be filled with dark blue enamel and then polished flat. And when it's finished, I'll have it gold plated. So the gold against the enamel. Silver is okay, but silver deteriorates with age, it discolors. Gold doesn't. And so that will be going on the new watch. And with the sweep seconds, as I said, and it will have more, the new movement will have more of my design ideas in it, in the flying cocks and the couple of shapes within it. So, and once we hang up from here, I'm actually sort of working on the case design.
So now the new movement for the new watch, you're done with the white series. Am I correct? You're done with the whites?
Pretty much, I have one left to finish off when it comes on, but yeah, and the white was actually in my mind a logical step to do the next thing. And I was experimenting with some ideas. So this is the next one where I can improve the beveling and the finishing on the watch itself, and I designed it in a way that I could show it off better and also have better and bigger beveling on the piece.
And this is only tangential to horology, but I've always wanted to ask you this. Did you intentionally name your watch the Walter White after the infamous TV character?
Somebody said that in New York, and honestly, I wish I could say yes, but it never even occurred to me. but I quite liked it. Like some ways I could identify with Walter White and his frustration in general. Maybe not what he ended up doing or how he ended up in general, but no, I didn't. I started off. It seems nowadays watches have to have names. Years ago, a watch was the watch, and it was a Dufour, it was a Vautelaine, it was a Daniels, whatever. And then watches started to have names, and you couldn't just have your watch. Didn't seem to be enough, and so I didn't want to. I particularly don't like some of the pseudo-Latin names that come out of Switzerland. One of the things is they're meaningless and quite often I think wrong anyway, or it's a meaningless caliber number. And that identifies the watch. So I think when what was it doing? The first watch I started doing is the platinum. And I called it the platinum because it's made out of platinum. Plates, it's all platinum, right? So it seemed to be a suitable name for it and to identify it. And then the next thing I did was a pocket watch, which you may have seen photos of that I made, which is a tantalum case. And that's in particular, that client did not want gold, didn't want steel, didn't want platinum, and didn't want silver. He liked silver, but the trouble is it's soft and it tarnishes. So we thought, what could we come up with? So tantalum, came to mind, and tantalum has a natural blue tinge to it. When you work it and polish and leave it sit there. And I had a jeweler friend come and he said, "Oh, what sort of material is that? It's blue." Yeah, I mean, is it really bright blue? No, but it's blue compared to say, steel or silver. And so hence I thought good name for that is that's why I called it azure blue. And so it seems I landed on having color names for my pieces, which then the white came along because the movement is rhodium plated, it's white, the dial is white, the case was steel, so it's white, so hence it got called the white. And the new movement that I'm working now is Ecru, which means, if you like in French, off-white, which is not quite true, but in the way it's coming along. And this one is not rhodium plated, it's German silver plates.
So now I know in the past you've worked with I think you worked with a Hamilton train for the Azure, and I think Omega 266 was it for the white?
Yes.
Are you going to be adapting the 266 to something like an indirect center seconds for the new watch?
Yes. When I designed the new watch, I actually designed it as sub-seconds. And then, in all honesty, I wanted a different dial to the engine turn dials. Not absolutely, Josh's dials are fantastic. I just wanted to do something different. And for about a year, I dithered around, what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? Colors, pad printing, this, that, or the other. And then I came up with this idea of an enamel dial. Dark. In truth, I said that it could be multicolors, but the first one is going to be just a single solid blue enamel polished flat. And I actually really like some of the enamel work, like we see various places that have like scenes on them, either like animals or locations, or there's somebody did a nice Art Deco decorations. But all those things are personal. What might appeal to 5 people, 50 people will not like, including me. So those are sort of kind of almost have to be unique commissions. But because I make each piece by itself, if somebody wants something a little different, it can be done. As opposed to we're doing a production, well, this is how we make it, and I'm sorry if you don't like it. But we don't do custom. And where possible, I'll do customization if practicable.
Okay. So now I do have a question about one aspect of making movements. And you work entirely by hand. You make wheels, you make pivots, you make bridges, plates, every part of the watch, basically. The one thing I often see is that smaller watchmakers will rely on the train dimensions, the drivetrain dimensions of an existing caliber. And I've always just wondered why that is. It seems like making all of the specialized parts would be the harder part. Why is the train dimension the thing that's often carried over?
I think availability. Wheels are not too bad to make. They're quite easy. Pinions are a lot more difficult. One of the other things, of course, is the time consuming. It's the cost. And as 2 things happened. Years ago, when I was thinking of doing the platinum, I asked a number of collectors that I knew, just what they thought, what their feelings were. And something else, and I said, well, I can make the complete train escapement and everything, balance the whole lot, but it will cost this much, which is in the Roger Smith category. Or I can use something like a Hamilton train or another Swiss train, and the price will be a third of that. Got just making all the train and is really an expensive undertaking and time consuming. Also, as one collector said to me, he said, it's actually a nice idea. He said, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with Hamilton train and escapements. And it's going to take you 5 years to learn how to do it. And I don't want to pay for that. And I mean, he was being kind. He was not being nasty, but it was a very realistic situation in there. But as soon as you start making absolutely everything by yourself, we end up in a really steep price. We end up in a 6-figure price category, and not the low 6 figures either. So whereas if using an existing train, it cuts out an awful lot of work. And then equally as almost anybody, Dufour and Sean and Roger, admit to the same thing, is that probably 40-50% of their time in making the watch is finishing. Because finishing is laborious, it's slow, it's laborious, tedious, and then sometimes you think you've done a great job and you come back in the morning and realize that you need to start again. And it's true, and often do something, it looks okay, put it down, walk away, come back either later or tomorrow. And if it still looks good, you're done. And if it doesn't, well, you better work on it some more.
This kind of flows into my next question. I was at Dubai Watch Week, 2 years ago in 2019, and Stephen Forsey was with me, and he was showing a new watch called the Handmade 1 to a client. And that's something they just launched that year. And they said, we're going to be able to make 2, maybe 3 of these a year, entirely handmade, all traditional process, 18th century. And the client asked, well, what about the rest of the watches you make? Aren't they handmade? And he had to explain, well, no, there's handmade, and then there's really handmade. You work really handmade. No electrospark erosion, no CNC. What does that take compared to automating the process?
money. Automating the process actually takes money because as people I know, if you CNC machine is nice, but actually you need to be able to program it. And that's an occupation by itself, right? You need to be able to buy the machine, which to get in the accuracy and repeatability level we want are not cheap. Yes, you can buy cheap CNC machines today, or they're not really cheap, but they're still some tens of thousands. And to get into something good like I know Rolex uses Kern CNC machines, you need to $250,000 just for the machine. And then you have to be able to drive it. There's no point in having it if you don't know how to run it. And then that's another occupation by itself. And okay, say, okay, yes, you can do CAD drawing. Yes, and we've all seen people who do CAD drawing and they click, click, and it grows great. But they spent 5 years to learn how to do that. And even then there's pitfalls. You have to do it still the same as handwork. You do it, and if it's not right, you fix your errors and do it again. And then you fix your errors and do it again. The major thing about that is you don't need the hand skills to actually make it. And you can make multiples exactly the same. Where when you're doing it by hand, to make 2 things or 4 exactly the same is super challenging.
And it was actually interesting to me to realize that Grubel Force, he had to explain to a client that using, Grubel Force makes 100 to 120 watches a year, and they're beautifully finished, they're beautifully made. But even with all their resources, they could only get through 2 to 3 full handmade, simple tourbillon watches per year. Just hands and tourbillon, they could make 2, maybe 3 of them per year. And that's the process you're using in your studio. You're making watches that way.
That way, yes.
So,
and although I must admit, I think Grubel Force have the best finishing of anybody on the planet. That includes Vertelainen and Dufour. A friend of mine in Switzerland described it as exquisite finishing with prices to match.
that's an apt description.
And very accurate. I thought, yeah, he's got that right. So.
I got a question for you too, since it kind of flows from what we just said. Are there any watch brands, models, or trends that have your attention in the industry today, for better or for worse?
Not really. Somebody asked me recently, did I see about this new watch, a factory watch? And I said, and I realized that I had just basically lost interest in factory watches. The part of it is Swatch Group owns so much, and you can have a Longines or Lissi Nardin, and it's an ETA movement. Maybe it has a different module on top of their own. And I thought, if I want to buy a Ferrari, I would like a Ferrari, but I do not want a Ford motor in it. And if I buy a Mercedes, or a BMW, I'd like a Mercedes or a BMW engine. I don't want a Toyota. No matter how good the Toyota engine is, it's not what I want in my M-class BMW.
Again, that flows into another question I wanted to ask. George Daniels was a car collector. Derek Pratt liked his motorcycles. Do you have any passions, mechanical or otherwise, outside of watchmaking that drive you?
Yeah, I do. I've got a vintage Rover P6 that I actually stripped down to nothing and rebuilt. And I would like to actually spend more time on it, but I haven't been lately. But it seems most watchmakers are also car people. Although I wonder if that with electric cars, if that future is not being limited.
The quartz car, I guess.
The quartz car. I think Vianney Halter is also into aircraft and machinery. He has machinery. Look, why have you got this thing here? This looks like a 1,000-ton press. I think he got it. I think maybe because it was available, and different. Most people seem to be car people, especially like in my age. I think it's the mechanical fascination.
So one thing I noticed is that F.P. Journe is French. He went to Switzerland. Kari Voutilainen, he's Finnish. He went to Switzerland. Stephen Forsey is English. He went to Switzerland. You did go to Europe earlier in your career in the 70s, but since 2002, you've been camped out in Southern California. Is there a reason why you chose Southern California, of all places, for watchmaking long term?
Well, actually, I had tried to in the 70s to move to Switzerland, and really the door was closed. I mean, they were under pressure from the quartz revolution, and indeed they almost went bust. And you know, and to get there, just I had my own money, I had everything I needed. They just at that point were just closing doors and didn't want outsiders in. I don't think they're keeping me out. I think they're trying to protect their own industry, which I think actually was a shortfall because now they don't have enough people for the industry. And then uh, mainly moved to California because most of what I was making came to the States. And on several trips, I'd always liked the States. I felt comfortable and at home here. And so ultimately I decided to move here. And then some years, 2008, one of the DW5 high precision clocks went to Switzerland. And when we were setting it up there, the client just said, he was actually, I think he was encouraging me to move there. My wife, Deborah, is a California girl who speaks English. I'm not sure how she'd get on with French and German. And then there's that other thing. Yeah, winter. With cold snow and everything. So it might be okay for a year or so, but after that, it might get a bit, I don't know, cabin fever for her, and perhaps even me. But this big client did say, he said, just imagine how good it would be if you had made in Switzerland on your pieces. And he was right. Yes, it would be there, but I'd already moved here. I didn't fancy picking up and moving and all over again. Moving anywhere is difficult. Changing countries is even more difficult. And re-establishing. So I set up here, and so really, whatever they're doing there, we can do here in the States. There's no exclusivity for it, and I think people, ended in Switzerland because kind of where largely where the materials, skills, and machinery was available, and a lot of it is specialized equipment. It's not just general engineering stuff. It's specialized for the horological trade. And I mean, even Rolex Rolex started in London, in England, and they moved. And the first Rolexes were not Rolex, had Rolex stamped on them, but there were several other manufacturers, high grade movements. And I'm going to say in the late 20s, but I'm not sure exactly. They moved to Switzerland, to Geneva, simply to be closer to their sources of materials.
So then I guess, does it surprise you that as an Australian by birth, trained in Australia, apprenticed in Australia, early career in Europe, you're now considered something of a dean of American watchmaking and an elder statesman for the US watchmaking community? You mentioned Josh Shapiro's learning from you. You've got a couple of other apprentices working in clocks and watches. Does it surprise you that you've become looked at as sort of like an honorary American in the watchmaking space? People think of you as like, I guess, the brigade of American watchmakers.
I didn't set out to do that, but I'm actually quite flattered and pleased by it. And part of the reason I'm helping others is I had to learn what I'm doing the hard way, as schools weren't there. It was not like today where information is more easily found and people were doing innovative things. Those days was kind of stuck where they were. And so if somebody shows interest, I'm quite happy to help them. And despite what some people think and what we do, there are no secrets. Anything I do or anyone else is doing has been done in the past somehow. Materials may differ, designs definitely differ, and equipment is far better than there was in the past. But if I can help somebody do it, I will. It makes the whole trade a whole lot better for everywhere. And there's more activity and interest in America now than there was 10 years ago, and certainly more than 20 years ago. So I'm quite happy to be part of that and bring American horology to the forefront again, because it was once in the 1800s. It was so far ahead of everyone else, it wasn't even funny.
You're not kidding. I actually collect American pocket watches, and that's kind of where I started like my personal watchmaking. And I thought this is an incredible watch. How am I able to buy this for $400? This thing's incredible. 23 jewel, Sangamo special from Illinois. And it's like, I can buy this thing for the cost of a strap. It's exciting to see where the country has been in the past.
Yeah, and excellent pieces, and in the States, this is understood, but overseas, it's not understood because the industry as a whole, for whatever reason, mostly exported the cheap watches, either 5 jewel or 7 jewel, no finishing, brass plates, basic models in nickel, silver, stamped out cases. So the American reputation was given as cheap, nasty watches. Did they work? They worked very well for what they were, and neither the Swiss, French, nor English could compete with them for what they did at that price range. But at the same time, it tarnished their reputation. And I've shown, friends in Europe, they said, I don't know, 23 jewel, a Hamilton or a Howard or Illinois, from 1880s. You take that and show them that, or even better, a Hamilton 992 from the 40s or 30s. You take that, they cannot believe what they see. But they had no idea that such things existed because the home market absorbed it all. And they didn't have the foresight, I think, to try and export and get into those, more upmarket pieces.
I guess we should keep it a secret so I can still get my hands on a supply. Don't let anyone know.
Fortunately, they made vast numbers of the piece. I do have one collector friend. He has, I don't remember the watch. It might have been in Illinois, but he inherited it from his father, who was a collector. He had an example of every 23 jewel American watch made. And he has an example of one of which only 2 are known. And I've actually seen them all, and they are really outstanding. One thing that does generally, it appealed, American watches were designed for efficiency, and especially in the dial, but the dials often lack something in design. Can you tell the time? Yes, very easily. Is it really pretty? Not so much. And so often say, that's a great watch. It's a pity about the dial.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. They were very efficient
and English,
mechanized.
Yes, and English and Europeans, and including me, tend to prefer Roman numerals, where North Americans tend to prefer Arabic.
Yeah, when I want to say when Webster Ball wrote down his standards for a railroad chronometer, he mandated the Arabic numerals because I guess us folks in the States, we had trouble figuring out the Roman numerals, but he mandated that for easy reading, they had to be Arabic numerals.
I suppose so. I'd feel that as well. There's no ambiguity, and theoretically, you shouldn't have to question whether that's a 4 or 7.
Good point. Are you a watch or clock collector yourself? Do you have a personal collection that you keep?
I have a few antique pieces here, mostly English long case clocks, and I've got a number of my own clocks that I made. I do not have anything of my own that I've made here in the States. It's all from Australia, or the first 2 clocks I made when I was still in Vienna. I have, and a watch collection I did have. I've got a couple of bits and pieces that I was thinking of selling off, that I bought took my fancy at some time, but never got around to it. But other than that, no watch collection other than my own. My own watch that I've made. The very first watch that I finished off in the Presidio, which was done when I first met Joshua Shapiro, and he hadn't actually made any watches as such yet. And I was looking for an engine turn dial for a clock. And we were just talking about it. And I thought, well, actually, I remembered I had 5 Soprod like ETA replacement movements. I had 5 cases from something that I'd never ever done. And I thought, well, what about this? Let's see if we can work together, if you can do that. I've got these 5 watt movements cases. Let's make 5 dials. And at least it's an experiment for both of us, to see ideas, can you work together or not? And I did that. And out of that, my wife got the first one. It was sort of subtle, like I get the first one, right? As if this was a discussion. So there was 5 of those, which I did. And she has that one, and I have the prototype 1 of the white. There's also Brianna, who you might have known. She has prototype 2, which is the white with Chinese numerals. And we had the Chinese. It's funny, it's a bit like Arabic. If you go look on, you want to do an Arabic dial, no, sorry, a Roman numeral dial, and you go look for fonts, there aren't any. And it's like, oh, they're made up out of 1s and V's and X's. Yes, no, they're not. That may be what it is. So I have my own font I've used for Roman numerals. I developed 40 years ago. And I also have my own font for Arabic as well. And when I wanted to do the Chinese, he thought there might be a font for Chinese, and there is, but it's sort of like military numbers. They're very clear, they're very explicit, and they're dead ugly, but you cannot be confused. So those numbers, first they got a calligrapher in China to actually draw on a big piece of paper the Chinese characters. And 12 is apparently a difficult one. If I remember right, 12 is not 12, it's 10 plus 2. And so we had somebody do that with a brush and ink, traditionally on vellum. And from that, we sort of photo reduced them and then put them onto the dial of the watch. And as far as I know, nobody has ever done a Chinese dial watch with classical characters on it before. And it's really pretty. So Brianna wears that one.
Now, I can tell you're still really excited about watchmaking, the way you talk about it, the way you explain your new watches, new projects, your apprentices. But there are those apprentices, and you are teaching, and you're leaving a legacy. So I've known a couple of master watchmakers who've said, once I've made every watch that interests me, I'm going to teach. And that'll be my legacy. You know, how do you see your legacy? Is it teaching? Is it staying in the game and building watches?
Yeah, that never teaching as solely never actually never even crossed my mind, but it doesn't appeal to me either. You know, somewhat along the line, I need to do. And I dare say, as you get older, you know, you'll slow down a little bit. I mean, Daniel's died with a watch on his bench that he'd started years before and never completed. But he'll probably always say, "I'll get to that one day," you know. And days go on, your eyes get a bit tired, your hands get a bit sort of not quite so nimble. You feel less comfortable seated at the bench for hours, and maybe something else interests you or something like that. Certainly don't have as much energy. But no, I expect to keep on making things. I don't plan. I think throughout history, watchmakers have never retired. You just keep on working until you fade away at the bench. And if you have the passion in doing it, and there's always something new and interesting to think about. And if you haven't got, let's just say that spurt of enthusiasm of something. I started off doing the new watch, and I changed it to sweep seconds. And if you haven't got the enthusiasm for figuring that out and something new and something different, not different for the sake of being different, but different for the sake of improvement, then you probably don't have a lot of future. You've got to have imagination and enthusiasm for whatever it is. And sometimes I've seen things. And with the first clocks, when I got my first copy of Art of Brigade book by Daniels in 78, 79, when it was fairly new. And I looked at the first things I saw in there was the double pendulum floor clock, the Brigade 3-wheel clock, and the exhibition tourbillon. I said, I want to make those. But at the time, and honestly, I did not know how. And then over the years, now I've made all of them. But it kind of, and then sometimes you look at something that looks really interesting, and certainly on the tourbillon, the exhibition tourbillons I've made, and on the last double pendulum clocks, I put in a Janvier style wandering moon, and Vianney Halter used a similar system on a watch years ago, and I'm actually putting that system into a wristwatch, and it's a really gorgeous display of lunation. And yet, as far as I can tell, Ante Janvier used it, I think, in 3 clocks in a couple of slightly different variations. I've made 4 of them, and that's it. Nobody else ever touched them, and I don't know why.
Well, I mean, that's really exciting, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I've had people say, oh yeah, I want to teach, leave some students, some apprentices. You're like, no, I want to keep making watches and I'm making new stuff. So if people want to look into getting a David Walter watch or clock, including the new models, where should they go? How should they reach out to you?
I do have a website which is not up to date. It's supposed to be, but it isn't. That kept me. Best thing is on Instagram. I'm there as David E. Walter. And as well as on, I say Instagram because I don't post as often as I should on there, but there's also a whole list of postings. If you can, I know I've been there 5 year maybe. You can see a whole range of things that I do, and often is not. I'm going. Your earlier question about who comes to, one of the type of persons that comes to me is they already have watches. They don't need. They want something different, but they don't want another one of. I don't want to say Sean, that's not fair, but they don't want another factory watch. They want something different. That's as one person in the Bay Area said to me, he was looking at something, and part of it he said, sort of $50,000. He said, that's not any good. He said, my employees can afford that. I want something they can't afford. And I thought, well, okay, I hadn't thought of it in that words. And he wasn't showing off. He was actually he was telling me he wanted something different. And part of the reason they come to me is because I can customize something. Or sometimes the pocket watch was a specific order. He wanted a pocket watch, wasn't sure about the dial. It ended up with a silver engine turned dial on it. Wasn't sure about the metal for the case. But one thing he did want was a watch that had 2 barrels. That was really what he wanted, and he'd been looking and couldn't find anything that tickled his fancy. And so, well, can you make something like that? So, give me a couple of days to think about it. Someone will ask something, and sometimes I might have an instant answer. Other times I might want to think about, well, I had an idea of that. Could this be done? And just put something together in paper, and worked out a costing and went from there.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Mr. David Walter. This has been an honor, and yeah, my gratitude as well as that of our audience. This has been super cool. Thank you so much. And
thank you. It's great being here. Nice. And if we can enthuse a few more people, so much the better.
Right. So time out, Tim out, David Walter out. And thanks for logging on, folks.